Welcome to the Pitt Rivers Museum. My name's Andrew McClellan. This evening, our talk is What's in Our Drawers, a presentation about the display of the Pitt Rivers Museum drawers by Pitt Rivers conservators Rebecca Plum and Head of Conservation Jeremy Udin. You're welcome to use the chat function. Please do introduce yourselves and say where you're from. It really adds to things. And of course, do ask questions. There's a separate chat function to do that. If your questions can be answered on the spot, then Jeremy will respond as we go along. Otherwise, I'll collect them together and pose as many as I can to Rebecca and Jeremy in the Q&A at the end of the conversation. The talk should last for about 35 to 40 minutes, but we'll see how that goes. A bit of housekeeping first. This event is a place for listening and learning and for conversation, and we welcome comments in the chat so that everyone can feel safe in taking part. We would ask you to be considerate of your fellow audience members and the panelists. Please keep your comments polite. Tonight's conversation, funded by Torch, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities, will be recorded and shared online after the event, probably tomorrow. Keep your eyes open. There'll be a survey as we go along, and we'd love to have your feedback. Now, the Pitt Rivers drawers are something close to my heart, and actually one of my earliest memories of the Pitt Rivers. I first visited the museum as a child, and what I remember most is opening a drawer and finding it full of spoons. Spoons from all over the world and all ages, all designed to perform a similar task, yet all subtly different. A vision of a shared humanity and also something about our uniqueness. I opened the next drawer, lots of forks, and the next, chopsticks. The drawers have continued to play a central part in my teaching in the museum, whether it's the magic potatoes from Cowley, the Playboy bunny incense sticks from Nepal, or the woven corn dollies from across Europe. There is a wonderful sense of discovery for adults and children alike as you open a drawer and see what you'll find, what story you'll uncover. So a project that curated the redisplay of the drawers is a wonderful way of improving access for our many visitors. We're going to start with a short 2-minute film just to show you what some of the drawers look like before and what they look like now. It's fairly rough and ready, recorded on a phone, but I think it'll give you the idea. So over to the film. I've got to say that Rebecca's task is one I am a little envious of, but I have been enjoying discovering the objects, all sorts of objects that I've never seen before as the project has unfolded. So with no further ado, over to the person that has actually been doing the work, Rebecca. Thanks, Rebecca.
Hi everyone, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Andy. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen and then I will begin in earnest. So hopefully you can all see my slides. So yeah, hi. It's great to be here this evening to talk to you about the work I've been doing at the Pitt Rivers Museum for the last year. So I must thank Andy and Liz and Nikki who work for Torch for hosting this event today. To introduce myself, I trained as a conservator at the University of Lincoln and graduated in 2018. Since then, I've worked with object collections and historic interiors for the National Trust. I've conserved an Anglo-Saxon skeleton for the Oxfordshire Museum Service, and I've also done a little bit of freelance work. To give you all a bit of background about the inception of the project, I'll be talking about tonight. What's in Our Drawers received funding from the Clothworkers Foundation, which allowed for an 18-month internship to be created. This funding covers the costs of hiring me, plus any tools and materials. An important part of this project involves laser cutting, and the museum actually purchased a laser cutter for mount making purposes as part of a project that they did a few years ago. So this cost wasn't included in the budget. The What's in Our Drawers project focuses on the openable drawers in the court, which contain a combined collection of 8,262 objects. I should stress that this total is likely to be higher due to accession numbers accounting for more than one object. The accession number refers to the unique identifying number given to an object within a museum collection. We've even discovered some objects which either hadn't been seen before or catalogued until we started opening the drawers. So there have been a few surprises along the way. Before I go into the details of the project, I'll give you a bit of context about the Pitt Rivers Museum itself and how the drawers sit within it. The Pitt Rivers Museum was founded in 1884 when General Pitt Rivers, an anthropologist, archaeologist, collector and army officer, gave his collection to the University of Oxford on the condition that a museum was built to house it. The collection at the Pitt Rivers has worldwide recognition and objects are famously displayed by type. With objects spanning the globe, the displays encourage people to think about the many ways people have approached the same problem and celebrates the diversity of life across the world. Within this setting sit the drawers, which can be found all over the court, lower and upper gallery spaces. These drawers are contemporary to the museum and form part of the well-established fabric, often containing objects of the same type. This mirrors the cabinet displays, with drawers containing everything from ceremonial and votive cakes to rafts and cylindrical zithers. In this photograph on the left, which was taken between 1890 and 1895, you can see some of the drawer cabinets. You should see them highlighted by the orange circle. Over the years, these have been added to, with more coming into the museum in the 20th century, although it's hard to put an exact date to this. While some drawers are not accessible to the public, a large majority of them can be opened by visitors, and it's these drawers which have formed the focus of my recent work. The accessible drawers in the court largely account for openable storage. This means that although they are quite hidden from display and not permanently visible, these objects are effectively on display when a drawer is opened by a visitor. This can create considerable problems from both a visitor and a care of collections point of view. It's worth reflecting on this quote from a paper written about the drawers a few years ago, as it does sum up the issue really well. Most drawers give the strong impression of being glimpses into the vast hidden world of what the museum has in storage. They are not part of an externally obvious narrative and do not attempt to tell museum visitors a story. From the visitor's perspective, the opening of a drawer isn't always an obvious thing to do. From the short time I spent in the court before lockdown, it was easy to see the curiosity generated by the drawers. Can I open them? Would be a frequently heard question, and there was definitely a sense that these spaces in the museum were not really meant to be seen by visitors. Unless you had been made aware of them by the front of house team or had picked up a family activity treasure hunt sheet to complete, then it was very easy for this aspect of the collection to go unseen. For visitors that did open these drawers, the objects contained within are not easily viewable. As you can see from some of the images on this slide, objects are wrapped in plastic sheeting and bubble wrap, contained in bags and boxes, some of which have been recycled from now historic commercial packaging, covered by foam padding, stored in multiple layers, or are just found loose in the drawer. Combined with the lack of context and minimal written explanation, it is difficult for people to engage with and learn about this collection. That said, there are people who really love this aspect of the museum, despite how chaotic it may appear. I think it's something about peering into a drawer and trying to glimpse what's inside that fascinates a lot of people. However, as I will detail, there were many reasons why these conditions really needed to change. From a care of collections perspective, the drawers present a number of problems. The most pressing concerns relate to the repeated action of opening and closing the drawers. Bearing in mind that these drawers are old, made from wood, and are often quite heavy, it often requires a bit of strength to get some of the drawers open. And here lies the problem. Many of the objects are stored loose and move around when the drawers are opened and closed, dramatically increasing the risk of damage occurring. With some of the drawers, this isn't so much of a problem as they are simply too full for any movement to occur at all. But having a drawer stuffed full of objects isn't exactly ideal either, as damage can occur from items being compressed. As seen in the top right photo, the repeated action of opening and closing some drawers also generates a buildup of wood dust, as some of the drawers slot tightly into the cabinets. Whilst this isn't an immediate threat to the collection, it looks unsightly and means that dust obscures the glass tops on the drawers. That said, although we know that it's likely to be wood dust, there is a risk that it could indicate pest activity that needs investigating. However, this is easier said than done. In their present state, the drawers are near impossible to monitor due to how full they are. It isn't easy to see the bottoms of drawers where pests are likely to hide, so it's a real problem when trying to assess what may be eating our collection. We do have pest risk zones, which mainly account for monitoring moth and carpet beetle, and some of the drawers have moth stickers on to alert us to materials which may be at risk, such as furs, feathers, and skins. This represents a proportion of some of the favourite things that moths love to eat. But again, it's very difficult to check activity due to overcrowding. It's not easy to decant hundreds of objects to check this activity either, as it requires finding space to temporarily keep objects. Another difficulty presented by the drawers relates to the retrieval of objects. As part of the University of Oxford, the collection at the Pitt Rivers is used extensively for research, with between 250 and 500 research visits occurring per year. That equates to hundreds of objects needing to be retrieved, with some of them being located in the drawers. Other reasons for object retrieval include community visits, loans, temporary exhibition, conservation, educational outreach, and sampling for scientific analysis. So as you can begin to understand, the collection does have a very active life. All of these factors necessitate the need to locate an object from a drawer, which isn't an easy task if a drawer is really full. As an example, a recent drawer contained over 400 individual objects, which has now been slimmed down to just 26. With some of the drawers being so full, it means that a lot of unnecessary handling has to be done in order to access an object. And it also makes the task of putting objects back much more time-consuming, as there is no set order in which the objects are stored. This slide represents a really small proportion of bad packaging methods that have also been uncovered. A lot of these boxes were recycled and were simply a handy and cost-effective way for a large number of objects to be stored. Unfortunately, this means that many of the old storage or display solutions are no longer appropriate for objects, especially in the case of old acidic card boxes and plastic containers that deteriorate quite badly over time. There are also issues with microclimates when objects are stored in sealed bags. This means that objects made from grasses, straw, bark, and rushes have desiccated and powdered inside these kinds of bags. It also makes it extremely difficult to see the object, as it's covered by the identification label. Consideration was given to the kind of environment that the objects removed from bags would be exposed to when redisplayed in the drawers. The quartz environment is largely uncontrolled, apart from the air handling units that run intermittently. But being quite a large space, the atmosphere is hot and dry and remains stable, even though it isn't as controlled as we'd like. Combined with the looking glass tops on the drawers, the risk to objects being redisplayed was considered low. And carrying out checks on the drawers to monitor pest activity and signs of deterioration would be made a lot easier, as all of the objects would now be more visible. With so many factors making it hard to access the collections, having a project to focus on how these issues could be resolved marked an important step in improving the way that we care for these collections. Importantly, we wanted the drawers to become more visible to visitors and become a more prominent part of the museum experience, whilst also coming up with a way to safely house these objects in their historic display units. In the next few slides, I'm going to explain some of the decision-making processes that were made to enable this transformational work to be carried out. So the first step in the process involves retrieving the drawers from the court. We have a target to work on about 4 drawers each week, but there is a little leeway with this depending on how many objects need to be processed. Prior to any work being done, a photograph of the drawer is taken to act as a record of what it looked like before. This is a really nice way to sort of track progress, and it also provides a visual reference point to look back on as we move through the project. Next, the drawers are opened, which is easier said than done, as it requires finding the right key and hoping that the lock hasn't jammed. Then the process of sorting through the contents can begin. Working with the joint head and deputy head of collections, each drawer's content is reviewed and a final selection of objects is made. This is often not a straightforward process, as many elements have to be considered, presenting a unique curatorial challenge. Most of the drawers are far too full, and so the process of redisplay has given us the opportunity to rationalize what we display in any one drawer. When you have objects displayed by type, you are dealing with a very wide range of materials reflecting one kind of item. For example, in one drawer you may find a pottery horse and a horse made from cheese. And yes, we do have 2 of these cheese horses in the collection. So it's never just a case of putting objects made from the same material together. Curating the drawers can also be difficult when some of the topics are as complex as divination and religious objects from Africa, and these objects often have accompanying complicated histories. Sometimes these are explained on old handwritten labels, and so, where possible, we try to make these labels visible. However, the handwritten labels are not without their own problems, often containing old-fashioned colonial language and even offensive terminology. It is therefore very important to consider how we might tell object stories in a more sensitive and inclusive way. This is in line with the museum's recent activities to address its difficult colonial past, and so in this case, labels containing derogatory language are flagged so that they can be addressed through the Labelling Matters project. Labelling Matters aims to identify areas of improvement and to trial ways of changing the museum's public texts where derogatory and problematic language have been identified. Ultimately, though, it's about having respect and a respectful approach towards the objects in our care, as well as to the communities that these objects are made by or originate from. As we move forward and begin to address these complex issues, continuing to work with originating communities will be extremely important if we are to make the Pitt Rivers a more diverse and inclusive space. As a conservator, this respect must also extend to the way we store, display, and treat items. And with the drawers in their present state, with damage and overcrowding occurring, it was evident to see that these conditions needed to improve. With many of the drawers also containing objects that have never been contextualized, a post-sized card size space located in the bottom right-hand corner of each drawer will house a label with descriptions. It is challenging to create a succinct description for multiple objects, sometimes covering a variety of places, uses, and materials, but it marks an important step in telling object stories and opening up the collections to our visitors. It can also be easy to discount objects based on the fact that they may be in a bad condition, especially when there is another example of the same thing which could be included instead. Where possible, objects which are interesting but in a bad condition are assessed. If the condition of the object can be improved through conservation in a way that allows the object to exist safely in the drawer, then it's selected for display. In the case of objects that require extensive treatment or would not be able to be housed safely in the drawer, time constraints and feasibility mean that these unfortunately have to be discounted. Many of the drawers have been lined with foam, which has been stapled in place. Often this isn't effective in cushioning the objects and also looks unprofessional. To improve this and provide the drawer with a conservation grade liner, a layer of thin museum grade foam called Plaster Tray is cut to size and laid into the base of each drawer. I can't go on to the next stage of the process without discussing what happens to all of the objects that are not selected for display. Every week I decant hundreds of objects from the drawers. This sometimes causes a bit of a headache for the rest of the conservation team as it requires a huge amount of processing. When you've got drawers literally stuffed full of objects, it isn't physically possible to rehouse them all for display, as there simply isn't the space. Whilst it's a shame that we have to take out some objects, it has given us the opportunity to photograph and condition assess the collections, which was something that hadn't been done on a large scale with the drawers before. So in terms of improving our object records we hold for these objects, this has vastly improved the information about them. This information can also be accessed by anyone wishing to view our object records through our online collections database. And whilst we have to send objects to storage, They are packed in a single layer and buffered with acid-free tissue, which in some ways makes them a lot easier to access than before. Rather than having to rifle through a crowded drawer, an object's location can be found, a photo of the object identified, and the right box retrieved. So I have to say a huge thank you to Jem, Jenny and Andrew, my colleagues in conservation. It really is a massive amount of work to undertake at points, and I couldn't do it without them. Once the objects have been chosen, a new display layout can be created. This stage of the project has involved quite a bit of experimentation as development of the process took a bit of time to pin down, but the decision to try and laser cut plasters out housings for each drawer answered the multiple needs for improving the drawers. Firstly, it buffers the objects so that they don't move around when the drawers are opened and closed. Secondly, it creates a recognizable display environment, which is important in opening up the collections to visitors. Consistency and repeatability were also key factors to consider when refining this process due to the large number of drawers. But the process starts with arranging objects into a layout, which you can see on this slide. I like to do this in the drawer to start with, as I need to factor in the depth so that the lid can be locked back in place. The visibility of objects towards the back of the drawers is a little limited due to a wooden overhang, so where possible, I had tried to keep the objects forward at this point. Once I'm happy that the layout will work, I use a foam board cut to the interior sides of the drawer to place the objects onto. Because I need to take a photograph of the layout, this board sort of acts as a one-to-one template for me to work from when I come to creating the layout. The vivid green colour is also useful in making objects stand out against the backdrop, which is important when creating digital outlines. I then photograph the layout using the copy stand, which you can see on the left, set to the highest point, and this helps minimise any fisheye effect that's created by the lens. On this slide, you can see the layouts on the green backgrounds, all ready for creating the digital file. So once I've got a photograph of the new layout, the process to create the digital one can begin. Adobe Illustrator was chosen to create the layout as the final outlines can be easily imported into laser cutting software systems. It's also really good for creating outlines around an object, as this part of the process needs to be done quite precisely, and I use the pen tool to do this. I start creating an artboard that is the exact size of the drawer interior, then place the photo and expand it to fit. If I've cropped the photo accurately, the image should fit exactly into the artboard, which indicates that I've sized it correctly. Once I'm happy with the size of everything, I start drawing outlines around each object using the pen tool. This can take a little bit of time to get used to, but it's quite an accurate way to create these outlines. Often there are quite a few objects in a drawer, so it can take me quite a while, especially if there are sort of hundreds of small objects in one drawer. The great thing about doing this digitally is that you can easily rearrange things. So if you suddenly feel that an object would be better placed somewhere else, you could literally pick it up and drag it on the screen. So there's quite a bit of flexibility there. An important step in this process involves the creation of finger holes. Whilst the objects may go into their slots easily, it would be a bit of a nightmare if you didn't have any access points. So this is done by placing circles over the outlines at points which are suitable for handling, like you can see in these photographs. Then I blend the shapes together using the Cloud Builder tool, which just merges them together. The final step in creating a new drawer layout sees each outline getting an accession number. This is really just to make finding objects a bit easier for staff who retrieve and return objects, particularly if there isn't a photograph of the image in our collections database. It will also help to minimize handling, as you won't have to lift objects to find the number if it isn't visible. This is done by typing out the number, positioning it, and then turning it into an outline so that the laser cutter can recognize it as a path. And on this slide, you can see the transformation from photograph to digital layout, all ready for laser cutting. So once I've made the layouts, I can now program the laser cutter. As I mentioned before, Adobe Illustrator files can be easily imported into the laser cutting software we have at the museum. An imported file looks like this, the image on the right, after each element has been programmed. As you can see here, for the purposes of telling the laser cutter what it needs to do, each component part has to be grouped and set to the correct parameters. The parameters refer to the speed and power that need to be set before cutting or engraving can begin. The first group consists of the accession numbers, seen in green. This group will be engraved rather than cut. The second group consists of all the interior shapes seen here in orange, and these will be cut. And the final group consists of the outline seen here in purple, which will also be cut. So hopefully you can see the video. So this shows the draw layout in the cutting phase. It's quite noisy, and it's also quite difficult to say how long this process takes from start to finish, as it very much depends on how many objects are in one drawer. But it can range from about 5 to 20 minutes per layout. It's definitely worth it for the end result though, which I have an example of on the next slide. So as you can see, you end up with a lightweight Plaster tray, which can be easily slotted into each drawer. These inserts are also really useful too, which you can see on the right, as they can be used to raise some objects up and down so that they're easily visible, especially if they're sort of flat. I use a hot wire cutter to do this, which is really good at slicing through this foam to make the platforms for the objects to sit on. And so on this slide, you can see some of the completed drawer layouts. And I hope that you'll agree that they are a big improvement on what we had before. So from the top left, we have objects ranging from religious and divination artifacts, amulets, writing implements, globular flutes and animal whistles, geomantic compasses, scrimshaw, and objects representing animal form in art. From feedback we have had from visitors pre-lockdown and front of house staff, the difference in how they can be viewed and used is dramatic. It's so much easier to view all of the objects, and the layouts actively encourage people to make their own associations, as well as discovering the similarities and differences between objects. And the objects are now much safer now that they are safely housed in these custom-made trays. It's been amazing to see the transformation as we've moved around the court, and we are keen to encourage people to look in the drawers. I did design this logo, which we plan to attach to each completed drawer so that visitors could track our progress. However, at the time of writing, any publicity has had to be postponed due to COVID, as touching drawer handles isn't exactly ideal at the moment. But once we can, and the museum can welcome visitors again, we will be promoting the drawers. Another exciting dimension to the What's in Our Drawers project has seen conservation work being carried out on many objects in our collection. With such a vast number of objects coming into the lab, it was inevitable that some of them were going to need some treatment. So a lot of objects coming into the labs have just suffered from breakages caused by poor storage conditions in the drawers. On this slide, you can see some of the casualties from physical damage. So at a basic level, it was simply a case of finding these missing pieces and bonding them back together. Here's one of my favourite objects, an unusual looking horse and rider, which is just at the top of the screen that I got to work on. Whilst we aim to be minimally interventive with our treatments at the museum, I did have to support the neck by filling the gap with a bulked adhesive so that the bond remains strong, which you can see partway through application in the middle photo. Other common problems that cropped up when sorting through the drawers were textile samples that had been crushed, folded, or squashed inside old-style display boxes. Not only was some of the detailing being obscured or entirely hidden, the current storage conditions meant that these textiles were not being supported in the best way. Therefore, I decided to try and find a way of making them more visible whilst trying to work within the confines of the drawer. Unfolded, some of the textiles were going to be larger than the actual drawer space, so displaying them flat wasn't going to work in some cases. In most cases, I started by humidifying the textile samples to gently remove creases and folds. I then made padded calico rollers so that the textiles could be partially rolled onto them. This then allowed me to display them in the drawers with the roll part of the textile sitting in the cutout section of Plaster to prevent movement. Other textiles could be displayed flat, so this slide details a selection of material that I humidified and redisplayed onto padded boards. This means that handling the textiles is now a lot safer, whilst the board can be easily slotted back into the space in the drawer. Sometimes humidification isn't always possible, as was the case with this red bag with attached red seal, which you can see on the right of your screen. I didn't want to cause the animal glue holding the paper labels in place to soften or detach, or affect the fragile metallic threads that run down the front of this bag. But I did really want to improve the way the bag could be held securely for display and replace its current board. Instead, I dyed silk crepeline bands to match the colour of the cotton, which were then placed over the bag but under the threads. I then stitched the bands to the padded board, ensuring they were put under gentle tension to help flatten out the bag's shape. Due to the fragile nature of the metallic threads, I wove very fine threads through the strands and secured them in several areas. And finally, I stitched padded blocks to the board to create safe housing for the wax seal to be held in. Some of this work has also involved making custom mounts to enable easier and safer handling, and also better display. I've really enjoyed the challenge of figuring out how best to support objects, and it was an area that I hadn't had much experience with before I joined the Pitt Rivers. It was particularly important to ensure that these objects were supported in this way due to the opening and closing action of the drawers, so the mounts needed to be able to prevent movement. On this slide, you can see some examples of mounts that have been made for several objects redisplayed in the drawers. I particularly like the squeaking horse, which you can see bottom left of your screen. Similarly, lots of the collections at the Pitt Rivers are housed in these old glass plate top boxes, originally designed for display. Whilst they are old, they do form quite a recognisable feature in the museum. Like the drawers, we've had to find ways of improving the conditions inside of these boxes for a number of objects. Here you can see one such display box at the top of your screen. The green painted background had gone really greasy and had deteriorated really badly, leaving residues on the objects pinned into place. To start improving this display, I first unpinned and removed the greasy residues from each object. Then I created a new laser cut tray for the items to sit in, so effectively ending up with a miniature version of the larger drawer trays. Whilst efforts were made to save the labels, they have become really matted into the green paint, and I was unfortunately unable to separate them. In some instances, like the box of paper and wire creatures at the bottom of your screen, good old-fashioned hand skills were needed to cut some box inserts where the shapes are small. So although I love the laser cutter, it's not always the answer to everything. And sometimes it's necessary to create plaster inserts for objects that contain items themselves, like this Iranian writing case. In this instance, I wanted to make the items housed inside the case visible by displaying the box partially open. Again, a strip of plastazite was cut to size and slot for each of the objects hand cut. And now that the object is back in the drawer, all 5 component parts can be seen in context. In summary, what have we learned from this project and what has been achieved? So on this slide, you can see some of the statistics for work on the drawers so far. Since October 2019, we've completed 127 drawers to date out of the 176 that are located in the court. So we are on track to get the remaining drawers transformed by the time the project comes to an end this year. 2,507 objects are now redisplayed, but this number will go up as we work through the rest of the drawers. Slightly more objects have gone to storage, with the current number standing at 3,167. This figure also accounts for the total number of object record photographs taken and condition reports made to date, which marks a huge step in improving our object records. In terms of conservation work, 54 objects have received conservation treatment so that they could be redisplayed in the drawers. 34 custom-made padded boards have been made to support objects and enable safe handling, such as beaded jewellery or textiles. 103 old-style display boxes have received a brand new plastazite foam interior, either hand or laser cut. 20 objects have been frozen prior to being redisplayed to prevent any pests like moth from entering the collection and causing damage. And 133 objects have had a custom-made display mount made. Personally, I love working on this project. It's been really satisfying to see each transformation, each being totally unique due to the sheer variety of objects that are contained in the drawers. It is now so much easier to open and close a drawer without it jamming, as the weight of some of them has been drastically reduced, so handling them isn't so much of a weightlifting exercise anymore. Exposure to so many objects and materials has also been great, and my knowledge and skills as a conservator have definitely grown over the time that I've been here. It's also been really exciting to see the potential that laser cutting technology can have towards collections care. It's definitely something that can have multiple uses within a museum in terms of what we've achieved with the drawers and our other activities. We've begun thinking about the ways custom mannequins could be laser cut for some of the textile clothing we have at the museum. So it'll be quite exciting to explore this area in the future. And I've really enjoyed learning a new skill in terms of getting to grips with the laser cutting software system. The What's in Our Drawers project has also opened up opportunities for other departments to make more use of the collections in the drawers too. So we're really looking forward to seeing how the drawers can be used in future now that they have been made more accessible. And it will also mean that visitors will be able to see even more objects once we can open our doors again. And perhaps most importantly, the project has allowed for the collection to be cared for with the respect that it deserves, hopefully stimulating conversation and further research into some of the objects that have been uncovered. So I've got a few thank yous that I'd like to make. So thanks first must go to the Clothworkers Foundation, who've generously funded this project. It couldn't have happened without the grant we received. A big thank you must also go to my colleagues in conservation, Jem, Jenny and Andrew, who supported me with this project, as well as answer all of my questions. Thanks must also go to Faye and Julia and the collections team, who have also had a lot of input into the curatorial side of things. Thanks to Marenka too, whose knowledge has helped me to address some of the object labels containing derogatory or offensive language. Thanks also to Adi, one of our technicians who trained me in using the laser cutter. And finally, thanks must also go to Andy and the team at Torch, who have kindly hosted this webinar tonight. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thanks, Rebecca. That was so interesting, and I think we know that there is a great love of the drawers in the museum, and you're going to, when people finally get back into the museum when we reopen properly, you are going to bring so much joy to so many of our visitors. There's been a few questions along the way, and in particular, I'd just like to ask you about kind of accessibility online, which a couple of people have asked about, and you've made these amazing digital images, and we know that in the past there was no contextual information in the drawers at all, that these were not curated objects, and that there was a frustration when people opened the drawers that they had no idea what they were looking at and no idea about how to find out. Will there be an online I guess this is two parts to this question. Will there be an online presence in the end? And is there a way, because obviously there's not much in the way in contextual information in the drawers now, is there a way of people finding out what the objects are?
That's a very, very good question. So to date, we're looking at the objects in the drawer, and we've made records for all of them, and also for the ones that have gone to storage. The idea though is to have a whole shot of the drawer, so what you can see kind of now in the drawer after it's been transformed, uploaded online. But I think this process is something that's evolving. There's kind of like a new project underway to introduce a way of kind of uploading pictures to our database. So I've got a big backlog of the shots of the drawers that I took so far. So hopefully one day we can link them all to the objects on our file and make them available as you would do when you search for a single object. But I think Jen might have some more information on that.
Yeah, I think it's tricky at the moment because online, I don't think you can currently search by location in the museum. So you couldn't search for a particular drawer number and get up a record of all the objects in it. But as Rebecca said, we do have photos of all the finished drawers, and it would be possible to, on a website, list the content so that you could then look them up individually on the museum database, I guess. But it's not really something that we've discussed so far, but it may well be something that happens towards the end of the project.
Great,
yeah,
thank you.
it would definitely be nice to get them up online, make them accessible. And in terms of giving them context, so Faye from the collections team is looking at this. So she's writing labels for each of the drawers. It's a very, it's complex because often you've got to write a description for potentially like hundreds of objects in one drawer. So the challenge is, I guess, trying to address everything in that drawer, give it the information it needs, and also recognize when perhaps knowledge needs to come from outside. So talking to people that have associations with objects from originating communities. So that side of things and the input we can gain from that is going to be really important. So I think, again, it's something that's going to change as we go through. And there's quite a lot to do with I think the 176 that we've got in the court. So yeah.
Thanks, Rebecca and Jeremy. It was interesting that the cheese horse seems to have really got people interested in the chat, and I think that, you know, that for me in some ways that encapsulates the nature of the drawers, that it kind of highlights objects that you might not pick up in other ways. I was also really pleased to see that the hot cross bun, which was also mentioned in the chat, has now been accessioned, because it was given to the museum in the 1990s, I believe, by Hélène Laroux, who was one of the museum's curators, and Hélène was my mentor when I first came here, and my understanding is that she had a bet with another member of staff that she could send an object to the director and it would go on display. So hot cross buns are religious objects, so when they're stale you can't throw them away, so you're supposed to grate them up and put them in a cup of tea. Anyway, Ellen sent this anonymously to Skylar Jones with a letter telling all about the kind of cultural meaning behind hot cross buns, and it's been on display ever since. But I'm really pleased to see that it's now finally been accessioned. But it brings me to a question, which really is about the joy of what you're doing. What's been your most satisfying object to redisplay, and why, Rebecca?
Oh my goodness, that's like asking which is your favorite child or something. I think the ones that I've really enjoyed are the textiles, just because some of them are just crushed and folded up into a box, so you can just see that they're unhappy, and you're not seeing maybe some of the embroidery or some of the detail that you would see if it was flat. So I've enjoyed that a lot, because the rehumidification process, it just aims to sort of gently reintroduce moisture to an object. So you kind of have like this wand of mist that you wave over the textile. So you start from one corner and work your way to the other, and gradually weight the textile so that it can sort of dry out slowly without creases or folds. So that's been nice. And I mean, one of them, the beaded textile with the lapwing beetle shells on, that was completely folded in on itself, so you couldn't actually see how bright the colours were. So doing that was really good. And I like the fact that they're on boards that you can handle against a black backdrop, which often brings out some of the colours and the details. So I think I have to give it to the textiles, really, some of the favourite things I've worked on.
Great, thanks. We just had a question come in from Lucy Gwynn asking about the drawers themselves, which was an interesting question, which we didn't really, well, you did touch on it, and you can see in the film at the beginning that there's an element of stickiness to some of those drawers. Have you had to do any work on the drawers themselves so they open smoothly? And yeah, have you had to work on the drawers?
It's mainly been slimming down the contents. So before, when we tried to take them out, they're so heavy, they're literally stuffed full of objects. So they were just getting stuck on the runners because of the weight. So it's like a two-man job to get them out of the unit and onto the trolley and take them upstairs. So the main thing we've done is reduce the contents and therefore reduce the weight, which means that they slide much easier. We wouldn't tend to put anything in the drawers because they're sort of part of the historic fabric of the museum. They're sort of objects in themselves. So we wouldn't kind of wax them or anything to make them easier. So I think just reducing the weight will help. Obviously, some of them are still awkward, but you kind of get to know it a bit. And if it doesn't go at first, you just gently kind of persuade it to come out.
Some of them were literally full of rocks.
Yeah.
Imagine how heavy they were.
Great, thanks. And one of the things you mentioned in your talk was about taking the number of objects, was about when objects are retrieved and put back, that if there's no order within the drawers, or there's just too much in the drawers, that objects could get damaged, and that you kind of have to do a lot of object handling to find the one that you want. What you didn't explain, and some people in the audience will know the answer to this, but I'm sure not all do, why are staff retrieving and returning objects to the drawers? What's the driving force behind that?
It can be for many reasons. So we have a lot of community visits in which objects are sort of retrieved for people to look at, research. So if people are interested in finding out more about an object, they can come and look at an object in the research room. School visits have like handling sessions sometimes. What else do we do? I feel like there is more than that. Conservation treatment, obviously. If something is deteriorating, needs attention, then we bring it up to the lab.
Yeah, it might have been selected potentially to go in an exhibition or a redisplay, so that would be another reason to retrieve objects. But yeah, like Rebecca said, you know, it's quite a dynamic collection, really. It's used a lot. So objects are handled and, you know, taken out of storage and returned to storage.
Great, thanks. There's a question that's come in about timescale. It made me think of some other kind of questions or comments that had come up around that. So it would be interesting to know what's the timescale of your project, but also to put it into a perspective of you're not doing all of the drawers in the museum, are you? You're doing a percentage of them. So what percentage of the drawers are you doing? What's the timescale that you're doing it on? And if we were going to redisplay all of the drawers, how long would that take?
Ooh, well, I think in total there are 230 plus drawers which are publicly accessible, so they're the ones that you can open. The other drawers they've got like a bar running down the front, so they're effectively locked and you can't access them. So the project focuses on the openable ones. So we're 127 drawers into the 130. So about 100 left, I reckon. And initially this project was for 18 months, but because of furlough and lockdown, it slightly changed. So the timescale's slightly different, but I think I'll pass over to Jeremy. I think he'll be able to explain it better than me.
Yeah, so we did decide to concentrate just on the openable drawers, just because to do all the drawers would have taken, you know, 2 or 3 years more, I think. So yeah, I reckon it's about half the drawers in the museum that we'll end up redisplaying and repacking, and we'll leave the others for another project. But yeah, there are significant numbers of objects still stored in drawers, but for the time being, because they're not they're locked and the public can't open them, the objects inside get, you know, less of the stress and the trauma that opening drawers currently brings the publicly accessible drawers.
Yeah, you mentioned that some of the drawers can't be opened, and, you know, as you said, there's metal bars going down in front of them. It's really purposeful that people aren't going to open those drawers. Who decides which drawers are openable, which ones aren't, and why can't people open some of those drawers?
I don't know, actually. I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, some of the drawers have been modified with glass tops. I don't know whether that process just wasn't carried out for the rest of the drawers, or, you know, whether it's something we could look at in the future, is modifying the currently locked drawers to make them more accessible. There's certainly, you know, nothing different stored in there. It's not special storage. It's exactly the same kinds of objects. So yeah, I don't know why those drawers can't be made accessible. That could be something that we could think about.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I assume it must be sacred objects, or the alternative thought I had was that they might be full of ammunition for some of the guns on the top floor. But there we go. Yeah. How do you decide which objects get star treatment? Because you're making, I mean, it's one of the great things that you're able to do, I guess, that you're making decisions about what objects get seen and what objects will go into, you know, probably a fairly permanent storage. Are you doing that are you making those decisions? Is it a kind of collective decision? Is there a kind of committee that decides it? Is it a mixture of those things? How do you decide what kind of, you know, what's spotlighted?
I'd say that it's definitely a collective decision. So I think it's important to recognise that your specialism, so in our case, conservation, we look at the materiality of an object, so like the physical condition of something. So it's important that we get other people's opinions, which is why collections are involved, and also Marenka with the Labelling Matters project, looking at the language on some of the labels. So we want to kind of get as many threads and as many conversations about objects started as we can. So to make that process, I'd say like fairer, but more inclusive of all those factors. In some cases, objects are literally desiccating, so they're just crumbling to nothing. And you may have seen some in like the bags in the previous slide. So there's very little we can do for those objects in terms of remedial treatment. If we did decide to do something, it would take us literally years and years to stabilize it. So in some instances it's, okay, well that one's falling to pieces. We haven't got the time or the flexibility to work on it within the context of this project. But other objects like the textiles or things that were broken, there's something we can do relatively easily, and we should, because it's, you know, we've got the materials and the tools to be able to do it. So that opens up more content for people to see. But yeah, it's definitely a collaboration, and I don't think I would feel comfortable making that decision on my own. I think involving people is the right thing to do. I don't know if Jen wants to add.
I was going to say, it tends to be that we just end up representing a selection of what's in the drawer, but with vastly reduced numbers. You know, we may have 40 amulets from Japan and we end up with 3 of them. So we are still trying to keep the character of the drawers, I suppose, and show the spread of objects within them, but just do it in a more accessible and better way for the object.
Great, thank you. There's a question just come in from Jew, who says, I've worked with ecclesiastical textiles and small historical houses. The storage is often in drawers contemporary to the building. So far, I'd recommend lining the drawers with aluminium baking foil to form a barrier between the wood and its ligum oil and the textiles. Taught many to make made-to-measure rolls to support cuffs, collars, etc. Is that something that you've considered? How do you have a barrier between the drawers and the objects?
We've got a very thin layer of grey plastisite foam, so it's basically a very thin version of the black foam that we use with the laser cutter. So it just layers the bottom. So it's mainly to keep the objects cushioned. The drawers are made from wood, but because they've been there such a long time, we're hoping that most of the off-gassing has happened. So anything that could affect an object from the wood itself will be reduced, so the risk isn't high there. But the main thing is just the grey liner. So before we had very thin sort of like jiffy foam, and it's really easy to rip and tear, whereas the stuff we've got down now is a bit more durable. Yeah.
In some of our other redisplays, we would also use something like Moist Stop, which is a film which you iron onto the wooden base of a case to seal it. But we haven't done so with the drawers just because they are so dry and desiccated and have been in place for 150 years. So yeah, we're quite confident that any off-gassing will have happened and the objects will be safe inside.
Great, thanks. A question from Alan. What's the oldest item that you have redisplayed in the drawers? And I guess sitting alongside, you could turn it around the other way and say, what's the newest object that you've redisplayed?
I can think of an old one today. We have, you know, those plastic fish you get in Christmas crackers, the ones that tell you if you're fickle or, you know, we have a really old version of that. So the date on the label, I think it's like the early 1800s or something like that. So that's pretty old, predates the museum itself. Trying to think of other things.
Well, there's quite a lot of objects from Egypt, so you know, faience beads and various things from the Egyptian tombs. So they're probably amongst the oldest at, you know, 2,000 or 3,000 BC.
We've just done a drawer containing lots and lots of Egyptian beads. That's one of my favourites most recently. Newest objects. We've got a Pikachu whistle made from plastic in one of our whistles drawer. So that was like surprising. I think that's 2008.
Great, thank you. Heather asks, have you rearranged amongst the drawers at all, or is all work on a drawer strictly within the original drawer?
We have tried to keep it that way purely because it makes documentation and the process of sort of inputting any location changes a lot easier. But we have found that there are some drawers that are quite thin on the ground. So where we can carry a full draw's contents over to another one, we have been able to do that. So I think we did that for maybe 1 or 2, because it just makes sense. If you've got the space and the objects, we want to get as much as we can back on display, really.
Okay, thanks. Another question for you, which is really about you told us quite a bit about which object you enjoyed working with and why you enjoyed those. And I think I felt it was very much a conservator's answer. And it was that enjoyment brought from, from saving something effectively, saving something from further damage within a particular environment. I know which my favorite drawer is, which is the one that has the hot cross bun in it and the magic potatoes from Cowley and all sorts of other local kind of craft and folk objects, a lot of them from Oxford, and it's a drawer that I really love showing people, and I'm going to love it when it's been even more when it's been redisplayed. Of the drawers, which one have you found the most pleasing? Which one are you most proud of having redisplayed, do you think?
I really like the writing implements drawers, because it was just like a sea of bags full of sort of like Chinese calligraphy pens and pencils and all sorts of, it was just crammed. Like, you opened it up and you were like, wow, okay, there is a lot in here. So that was nice, and I enjoyed making that layout. So have like the ink pot at the bottom, and then they all kind of splay out. And I like that one the best out of the recent drawers that I've worked on. But I also really like the animal form and art. We've got a camel made from rope and textile, which is just amazing, like one of my favorite objects. I think it's a lot of people's favorite objects, really.
Yeah, I know the object you mean, I think.
Yeah.
That's great, thank you. We don't have any more questions coming in at the moment. I think we'll stop there. But thank you for a really intriguing presentation. We are closed to the public at the moment, although there's plenty of stuff on our website if people want to visit it. But keep an eye open, and when we reopen, come and have a look at the drawers, because they really are a wonderful thing. And I'd just like to say before we go, thank you for attending this evening's event. There is a visitor survey out there. If you haven't already filled it in, please do. It helps us improve our events and also helps us to apply for funding to run these kind of events. I'd just like to say a massive thank you to Rebecca and Jeremy for telling us all about this. Plus, of course, you, our audience, for coming along, and thanks to Liz and Nikki at Torch for just helping us to make this happen. Our next event has not been advertised yet, but it will be within the next few days or week. The next event will be on Wednesday, the 10th of February, and is by Marenka and other colleagues at the Pitt Rivers Museum. And Rebecca did allude to the amazing work that Marenka is doing in the museum at the moment, thinking about the interpretation. So the talk on the 10th of February will be Labelling Matters, a look at rethinking interpretation in the museum. So please do come along to that. We have slightly limited numbers on the amount of tickets available today, but that will not be the case on the 10th of February. So please do rejoin us then. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much.